Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what unfolded in Damascus over the past 11 days demands directness. Everyone is focused on the fall of Assad. Everyone is asking whether this represents a victory for democracy, a triumph for the Syrian people, or another chapter in the endless cycle of Middle Eastern instability. But that is not the real story. What we are witnessing is not a spontaneous uprising. It is not a grassroots revolution. What we are witnessing is the most sophisticated intelligence operation in the region since the Arab Spring, and one service orchestrated nearly every critical move. I am looking at communications intercepts and operational timelines that have been circulating among regional intelligence analysts for the past 72 hours. What they show is not a popular movement that spontaneously gained momentum. It is not a coalition of rebel groups that suddenly found unity. What they show is a carefully sequenced series of actions, each timed with precision, each designed to create the appearance of organic change while masking a level of coordination that could only come from a single controlling hand. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why one intelligence service changed the entire outcome in Syria, why every major power in the region now faces a strategic landscape they did not anticipate, and why the implications of this operation will reshape alliances from Tehran to Ankara to Moscow for the next decade. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively analyzed by Middle Eastern security officials and Western intelligence agencies simultaneously, and you are not getting this level of analysis from mainstream sources. Let's start with Damascus itself, because geography and infrastructure matter when you're trying to understand how a government that survived 13 years of civil war collapsed in 11 days. Damascus is not Aleppo, it is not Homs. Damascus has been the fortress, the last redoubt, the city that never fell, even when every other major urban center in Syria was contested. The Syrian Arab army maintained between 45,000 and 60,000 troops in and around the capital throughout the civil war. Republican Guard units, the 4th Armored Division, elite forces personally loyal to the Assad family, all concentrated in defensive positions that were built and reinforced over more than a decade. To put that in perspective, the defense of Damascus was more heavily fortified than any other position the Syrian government held. This means that any successful assault would require not just military force, but precise intelligence about troop positions, command structures, supply lines, and most critically, the psychological breaking points of key commanders. According to reporting by Al Jazeera and confirmed by multiple regional intelligence sources, rebel forces entered Damascus on December 8th with almost no resistance from units that should have fought to the last man. Major General Hassan al-Sheikh, a defector from Syrian military intelligence, has stated publicly that the collapse was not military. It was psychological and it was orchestrated. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of detail anywhere else. Now let us talk about what actually happened in the week before Damascus fell, because this is where the operation becomes visible if you know what to look for. Announcement number 1, the Aleppo deception. And this one matters more than anything else because it set the entire sequence in motion. On November 27th, rebel forces launched what appeared to be a major offensive against Aleppo. Western media covered it as a surprise attack. Regional analysts described it as opportunistic. But neither of those descriptions is accurate. The Aleppo offensive was a shaping operation designed not to hold the city but to force the Syrian military to commit reserves, redeploy elite units, and most importantly, to reveal which commanders would stand and fight and which ones were already looking for an exit. According to detailed reporting by the New York Times and corroborated by Turkish military sources, the rebel forces that entered Aleppo were equipped with communication systems, tactical drones, and real-time intelligence feeds that are not available to Syrian opposition groups operating independently. These are tools that require external support, technical training, and integration into a broader intelligence network. Commander Abdulrahman Noor, speaking to Reuters, acknowledged that his forces received what he called unprecedented battlefield intelligence during the Aleppo operation. He did not specify the source. He did not need to. Syrian government forces pulled the 15th Special Forces Division out of defensive positions south of Damascus and sent them north to Aleppo. That redeployment happened on November 29th. On December 1st, 2 days later, a separate rebel offensive opened in Hama, directly threatening the highway corridor between Damascus and the coast. The Syrian military now faced a choice: defend Aleppo or defend the supply route to their Alawite heartland. They chose the coast. Aleppo fell on November 30th. That is announcement number 1. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the decapitation of command loyalty. This is the part that Syrian officers themselves have confirmed in post-collapse interviews, and this is where the intelligence operation becomes undeniable. Between December 2nd and December 6th, 4 days, at least 12 senior Syrian military commanders either defected, refused orders, or simply disappeared. These were not low-ranking officers, these were division commanders, intelligence chiefs, and Republican Guard brigadiers, men who had spent a decade fighting for the survival of the government. The defections were not spontaneous. According to reporting by Middle East Eye and statements from Syrian opposition sources, each of these officers received direct contact from intermediaries offering specific guarantees, safe passage for their families, financial compensation, and immunity from prosecution. But here's what makes this significant. The offers were not coming from opposition groups. They were coming through Turkish intelligence channels, and the terms were too precise, too generous, and too coordinated to be anything other than a pre-planned strategy. Major General Barakat Ibrahim defected on December 4th and appeared in Ankara on December 6th. He told Al Arabiya that he was contacted by Turkish officials who knew the exact location of his family, the specific accounts where he held assets, and the names of officers in his division who were also preparing to leave. That level of intelligence penetration does not happen by accident. It happens when one service has spent months, possibly years, mapping every vulnerability in the Syrian command structure. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the role of Turkish intelligence becomes impossible to ignore. Syria has always been a proxy battleground. Russia, Iran, the United States, Gulf states, everyone has had a hand in shaping the conflict, but Turkey is different. Turkey shares a 560-mile border with Syria. Turkey hosts more than 3 million Syrian refugees. Turkey has direct strategic interests in preventing Kurdish autonomy in northern Syria and maintaining influence over any post-Assad government. And most critically, Turkey has the intelligence infrastructure, the operational capability, and the motivation to run an operation of this scale. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. On December 7th, one day before Damascus fell, Turkish President Erdogan held an unannounced 90-minute meeting with the head of MIT, Turkey's national intelligence organization, Hakan Fidan. That meeting was not on the public schedule. It was confirmed only after the fact by Turkish security sources speaking to Hurriyet Daily News. The next morning, December 8th, rebel forces entered Damascus. Syrian government forces melted away. President Assad fled to Moscow. The war ended. The reason the timeline matters is the same reason the Aleppo offensive mattered. Everything was sequenced. Everything was timed to create maximum pressure at minimum cost. Turkish intelligence did not need to fight the Syrian military. They needed to convince the Syrian military that fighting was pointless, that their commanders were gone, that their cause was lost, and that the best option was to go home. According to analysis by the International Crisis Group, the collapse of the Syrian Arab army was a psychological operation, not a conventional military defeat. And psychological operations of that sophistication require a single controlling intelligence service with deep penetration, strategic patience, and the ability to coordinate across multiple fronts simultaneously. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines because there are two stories playing out simultaneously and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The first story is the humanitarian story, Syrians celebrating in the streets, families reuniting, political prisoners being released from Sednaya. That story is real, and it matters. But the second story is the strategic story, and that story is about who controls Syria now, who benefits from the collapse of the Assad government, and what this means for the balance of power in the region. Russia lost its most important client state in the Middle East. Iran lost its land bridge to Hezbollah in Lebanon. The United States is left managing a Kurdish enclave that Turkey views as a terrorist threat. And Turkey emerges as the indispensable power broker in any future Syrian government. Think carefully about what this represents. When a regional power conducts an intelligence operation that removes a government, reshapes the strategic map, and positions itself as the primary external actor in a post-conflict settlement, that is not diplomacy, that is not opportunism, that is strategic victory. President Erdogan responded to the fall of Damascus by calling for an inclusive Syrian government that respects all ethnic and religious groups. He did not mention Turkish influence. He did not need to. The rebel groups that now control Damascus, Idlib, Aleppo, and Hama are groups that have been armed, trained, and in some cases directly commanded by Turkish officers. According to sources within the Syrian National Army speaking to Al Monitor, Turkish advisors are embedded with every major opposition faction. Turkey does not need to occupy Syria. It already controls the actors who will govern it. And here is where it gets personal. If you are European, if you live in Germany, France, or Sweden, What is happening in Damascus is not a distant foreign policy story. It is a refugee story. Turkey currently hosts 2 million Syrian refugees. President Erdogan has made it clear, repeatedly, that he wants those refugees to return to Syria. A stable, Turkish-aligned government in Damascus gives him the leverage to make that happen. If you're a European policymaker trying to manage immigration, you are now dependent on Turkish goodwill. That is not abstract geopolitics. That is leverage. If you are Iranian, what is happening in Damascus is a catastrophe. The land corridor that allowed Iran to supply Hezbollah in Lebanon is gone. The strategic depth that Syria provided against Israel is gone. The alliance that anchored Iranian influence in the Levant for 4 decades is gone. And it was removed not by American airstrikes, not by Israeli operations, but by a Turkish intelligence service that outmaneuvered Tehran at every turn. If you are Russian, what is happening in Damascus is a humiliation. Russia intervened in Syria in 2015 to save the Assad government. It succeeded. Russian air power turned the war. Russian military advisors rebuilt the Syrian Arab army. And yet, when the final collapse came, Russia could do nothing. Moscow evacuated its personnel from Tartus and Latakia, packed up its equipment, and left. According to defense analysts speaking to Jane's Defense Weekly, Russia's inability to prevent the fall of Damascus has damaged its credibility as a security guarantor across the Middle East. If Russia cannot protect a client state where it has troops, bases, and a decade of investment, why would any other regional actor trust Russian commitments? This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta fought for 27 years. Both sides exhausted themselves. Both sides destroyed their economies, their militaries, their political cohesion. And who won? Macedon. Philip II and his son Alexander rose to power while the Greek city-states tore each other apart. The parallel is exact. Syria became the battleground where Russia, Iran, Turkey, the United States, and Gulf states all pursued conflicting agendas. Every actor spent resources, blood, and credibility. And in the end, the actor with the clearest strategy, the most patience, and the most sophisticated intelligence operation, that actor is the one that wins. That actor is Turkey. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, Turkish consolidation. Turkey uses its influence over Syrian opposition groups to establish a federated government that is nominally independent but functionally aligned with Ankara. Kurdish forces in the northeast are pressured to disarm or withdraw. Iran loses its land bridge permanently. Russia maintains a symbolic presence but no real influence. European states negotiate refugee returns through Turkish intermediaries. This path requires that the opposition groups remain unified, that Turkey can manage internal Syrian politics without triggering sectarian conflict, and that external powers accept Turkish primacy. I assess this path as more likely than the others, but fragile. Path 2, fragmentation and renewed conflict. The opposition groups that took Damascus cannot agree on governance. Turkish-backed factions fight each other. Kurdish forces in the northeast declare autonomy. Iran backs Alawite militias in the coastal regions. Syria becomes a patchwork of zones of control with no central authority. This path triggers another refugee wave, destabilizes Lebanon and Jordan, and creates openings for ISIS remnants to re-emerge. The likelihood of this path increases if Turkey overreaches or if Gulf states decide to back alternative factions. Path 3. Great power intervention. The collapse of the Assad government creates a vacuum that draws in external military forces. The United States expands its presence to prevent ISIS resurgence. Israel conducts airstrikes to prevent Iranian weapons transfers. Russia attempts a limited re-entry to salvage credibility. Turkey finds itself managing a multi-front conflict it did not anticipate. This path is the most dangerous, but also the least likely in the immediate term because none of the great powers want another Syria-scale commitment. I think we are closer to path 1 than the headlines suggest. Turkey has invested too much, planned too carefully, and executed too successfully to allow fragmentation now. But the key variable is whether Ankara can manage the internal contradictions of a post-Assad Syria without triggering the sectarian fractures that have plagued Iraq and Libya. That is not certain. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, can Turkey maintain influence over Syrian opposition factions once they hold power, or will those factions fracture once the common enemy is gone? Second, will Iran accept the loss of Syria, or will it continue to pursue proxy strategies through Alawite militias and Hezbollah remnants? Third, how does Russia respond to this strategic defeat, and does it signal a broader retrenchment of Russian influence in the Middle East? Tell me in the comments what you think happens next. Tell me if you believe Turkey can hold this together or if we are watching the beginning of Syria's next civil war. We will keep tracking every development in Damascus, Ankara, Tehran, and Moscow. That is what this channel does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what actually happened in Syria and why it matters. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next breakdown, and we will see you in the next report.